In this talk, I want to introduce you to a new way of thinking about the conditions that we usually refer to as illness or disease. I want you to actually appreciate what happens and not get hung up on outdated, stigma-laden labels. And I am particularly anxious that you will come to appreciate alcohol problems within the same general context that you use in appreciating other medical and social situations. Now, in the last talk, we talked about the arena, the area where the action takes place between you and your world. But before going back to the model, I would like to go to the board and illustrate a few points. We shall build this part of the talk around three simple but related terms: ease, unease, and disease. In this area, we shall indicate our easy relationships with the world around us. The fact that we're able to be coping without stress. Playing it cool. Here, we're talking about stress situations or strain, but still coping. The world's beginning to gang up on us. We're no longer at ease, but we're still hanging in there. Nothing is broken down yet, but if continued for too long or in too intensely, we'll probably go on to the third area of breakdown. We recall the old Army expression that every man has his breaking point. And if we are trying to cope with too many stresses at once, if they become too intense, or if they're maintained for too long a time, there is a limit to our ability to cope with that situation effectively, to continue to function effectively. The words that we often use to refer to this state are the ones I already mentioned: illness, sickness, etc. Now let's take a little closer look at some of the situations required for our easy adjustments, our stress adjustments, and breakdown. Well, we might summarize this by balanced exposure and balanced response. Neither too much nor too little, but more or less just right. Stress situations are usually related to some form of imbalance, and probably best summarized by too much or too little. The word that I prefer for the breakdown, prefer to the word disease or illness or sickness or any other term, is disability. We can become disabled in so many ways. We might have a breakdown in our ability to cope for a few seconds, a few minutes, a few hours, days, weeks, or months, or forever. We might acquire an irreversible breakdown. Now, In order to illustrate these situations on our main chart, I shall use colored arrows. Green arrows to indicate our stress-free adjustments. A solid yellow arrow to indicate stress from too much. A broken yellow arrow to indicate stress from too little. A solid red arrow to indicate breakdown or disability from too much. And a broken red arrow to indicate disability from too little. Now, for the rest of this talk, we shall go over to the main model and illustrate how the action is represented by these colored arrows as I have tried to outline them to you. Now, you recall that in the first lecture, we indicated a range of good experiences, some of the good things that could happen between a person and the world around him. Now, you'll notice that we've changed the center part of the panel to illustrate some of the more undesirable things, the bad situations that can occur as a person attempts to cope with his biological world, his material world, and his human world. Now, first, I'd like to use this new center panel to just illustrate some of the classes of disability that all of you are acquainted with and which we have to be prepared to deal with somehow. First, with the biological world, what classes of disability can we expect from either over-involvement or under-involvement with this part of the world? Well, over-involvement with food will produce obesity. Under-involvement could produce malnutrition. Over-involvement with the world of microorganisms, a class of disability, infections, or infestations. Now, I'll take a few minutes talking about this one. What class of disability can occur with over-involvement of these naturally occurring chemicals that I've called chemical comforts? Well, just as we can call this class infections, over-involvement with living microorganisms, over-involvement with chemicals are called intoxications. Now, what about this material world? If we get over-involved with physical effects, physical forces, we have a class of disability called injuries. Now, again, I've deliberately indicated another chemical area here because it is so important. We can again, in the material world, encounter a whole range of intoxications. And for example, in the physical, if we get too much heat, we're burned, too little, and we're frozen. Under involvement with air, we suffer from asphyxia. Under involvement with water, we suffer from thirst and dehydration. Finally, up here, if we get over-involved with the whole world, including the human world, or under-involved, there's another class of disability we call mental and emotional illness. The control station just stops functioning. Now, that's enough to, I hope, let you appreciate that there's no more mystery about being hurt by over-involved with the world of chemicals than there is from being hurt by over-involvement with the world of microorganisms. Now, next, let's take a look at the nature of this world that you and I have to live in. This modern civilized world, which sometimes referred to as the affluent society, one of the main problems is that we are usually, many of us are exposed to much. We're exposed to more food than we can use safely. So we're likely to encounter a stress situation from our overexposure to food. We're likely to encounter stress situations because there's more alcohol around than anybody could drink safely. We have an overabundance of tobacco and other chemical comforts. Now, of course, in some parts of the world, and even in some parts of our own world, we suffer from under-exposure, under contact with food, malnutrition and starvation. Over here, we have access to far more drugs and chemicals than we can ever use. Sedatives, tranquilizers, narcotics, stimulants. You know, as long ago as 1970, I read a report that there were over 200 million prescriptions in that 1 year for these drugs alone, which is almost enough for every man, woman, and child in the United States. So that we have to live in a world in which there is a superabundance of all of these things. We also have to live in a world in which there are contamination from pollutants. You know, we have some say as to whether we'll encounter too many sedatives. We have some say about this. But we don't have much control over those chemicals that we encounter because they actually contaminate the air, the water, and the food, one of the hazards of modern living. I'd like to point out one green arrow in the last year, not the last year actually, the last century. We have pretty well gained control of the hazards with the world of microorganisms, so that we are safer as far as they're concerned, say, than our grandparents were. However, there's more going on in the business world than most of us can handle easily. Stresses because of this. There's more going on in the community. Traffic, speed, crowds, and probably too little going on in our personal relationships. The factors that determine whether or not one of these outside influences becomes a stress, the intensity of exposure, the frequency of exposure, and the duration of exposure will change a green influence into a yellow. Now, what about this little guy in the middle? Now, I think it's important to realize that now we're going to be talking about responses. When children start in to explore this world around them, they usually test out quite a lot of combinations. They may test out some of the chemicals. They'll test out certain social situations and so on. But later on, they're going to set into a pattern. But ideally, you got to remember that we actually could have a stress-free response to all of this in spite of all of these hazards. However, always not that lucky. And every so often, we begin to get into a stress relationship, say, with alcohol, or a stress relationship with business. And after a while, we may even break down and have a disease relationship, particularly mental or emotional illness. Now, in this talk, I have deliberately attempted to give you an overview. No attempt to be specific or be complete. As we proceed in the rest of this lecture series, we'll zero in more carefully on the changes in this person, the physical and mental changes as he encounters a range of alcohol problems, the physical mental changes, and how he relates to this whole world as these changes occur.